On our wedding night, he said, "I am tired." The room smelled of lilies and warm wax as my dress whispered across the floor. I lay still and listened to the clock breathe. Silence pressed on my chest like a steady hand. He turned to the twin bed and faced the wall. I told myself to wait. At midnight a thin sound stitched the hallway, soft and stifled, heavy with breath. I rose barefoot, the tile cool under my feet. A floral perfume met me that was not mine. The door at the end held a weak light. I pressed my ear to the wood. A low laugh. His voice. Hers. My vows slid from me like pins from a loosened veil. I did not scream. I chose silence. On our wedding morning I woke to a hush that sounded like promise and prayer, the kind of quiet that felt touched by grace. In the mirror the white dress caught the first line of sun and threw it back in a soft glow while my mother dabbed the corner of her eye and whispered that I looked like an answered prayer. I breathed in the scent of hairspray and lilies and warm skin and tried to steady my hands. My name is Aaliyah Brooks, and at 24 I believed I had arrived at a safe shore after years of swimming toward it. The clock on the dresser ticked in an easy rhythm, and I told myself that rhythm belonged to the life I was stepping into. Tasha Reed glided in with a breakfast tray and a smile that reached her eyes so quickly it left a faint ripple after it passed. And I let the ripple go because I wanted the room to hold only good things. She pinned the veil and smoothed the bodice and said the words every maid of honor knows to say. "You are stunning and calm and ready." I nodded and tried not to think about the way Julian Ellis had looked past me last night when he said "Good night, sweetheart," like a man juggling thoughts he did not care to share. My father knocked and stepped in with a tie that refused to lie flat, and I fixed it while he told a story about my first day of school, and how I had faced that hallway as if it were a wide road and not a tunnel. I reminded him that I had cried in the car, and he said courage does not cancel tears, and I kissed his cheek and promised to hold that truth. The estate in the Virginia hills opened like a soft jaw in the afternoon light, all stone and oaken windows that gathered the sun in long bright rectangles on polished floors. Guests moved through the courtyard like slow birds, hats and shawls and navy suits, voices softened by the music drifting from the quartet near the arbor. I could smell cut grass and something sweet from the kitchen and a thin line of smoke where a candle had just been lit. Evelyn Ellis, my future mother-in-law, supervised a row of place cards with a gracious smile that never changed shape. She pressed my hands in hers and said, "We are so happy to have you," and then turned to a catering assistant and adjusted a napkin fold with the tiny patience of a person who always knows exactly how things should look. I told myself it was kindness, and maybe it was. The ceremony began with a hush that lifted every head, and I took my father's arm and stepped onto a path scattered with white petals that made a soft sound under my shoes. The music rose and settled like a tide. I could see Julian at the end of the aisle, the clean line of his jaw, the bright tie he had chosen because it matched the ribbon around my bouquet. His mouth held a practiced smile, and for a second I thought I saw it falter the way a streetlight flickers when the wire is tested. But the moment passed and I chose to believe in the steady glow. When the vows arrived my voice trembled and then gathered itself, and I said "I do" as if those two words were a key turning. He said "I do" with a tone that was clear, although the last letter fell quiet in the air like a note that did not quite finish. We kissed while the guests clapped, and I let the sound wrap around us because applause is a kind of blessing and I needed all the blessing the day could offer. There followed the photographs and the soft shuffle toward the long tables under the trees. The sunset stretched the garden in gold, and napkins fluttered, and glassware caught the light. The meal came in careful courses: roasted chicken with thyme, green beans bright with lemon, little cakes dressed in cream that tasted like sweet air. My father rose and spoke from that place in the chest where a good father keeps the softest stories, and guests laughed and dabbed eyes, and I watched Julian lift his glass with a smile that did not quite touch his gaze. He sat when the toast was done and rubbed his forehead once, and I told myself the day was long for him too, that men carry nerves differently. Tasha leaned close and whispered a joke about my father's habit of saving napkins from every milestone, and I laughed because the joke was sweet and harmless, although a faint perfume clung to her dress that I did not recognize, and that is a small thing, but small things accumulate like quiet snow. Miss Joyce from church arrived late with a pie she declared too good to leave at home, and she squeezed me as if to press good fortune into my arms. Pastor Green blessed the table once more near the end of dessert, a simple prayer about steady love and steady bread. He told Julian to remember to pull the chairs back in after every storm and told me to keep the lights of home warm, and the guests hummed their approval. Music resumed and bodies swayed in slow arcs. I rested my head on Julian's shoulder and felt him breathe, but his breath did not match the music, and that is also a small thing. He excused himself to greet a cousin who had just arrived with a loud story about lost bearings and country roads, and as he crossed the terrace I noticed Evelyn step away from a group of women and touch her temple. She said to a bridesmaid that she was going into town for something for her headache and would be back shortly, and she left with a polite wave that gathered only a little attention before the song shifted. The evening settled into the kind of warm calm that makes hope feel weightless. Children chased each other around the fountain. Elder women traded recipes that belonged to whole branches of our people. Men debated whether the band should play a certain standard, voices friendly and stubborn in the same breath. I breathed that belonging into my lungs as if to store it for later. Tasha was at my side again, touching the edge of my veil with careful fingers, and in the movement the same floral perfume rose, bright and unfamiliar, and I almost asked about it, but the question felt like a pebble I did not need to drop into the water. A text buzzed on my phone and I ignored it. Julian returned and placed a hand at the small of my back and guided me to the dance floor for one last spin under the string lights. He smiled, a practice crest on a practice wave, and I told myself a practice thing can still be true. When the last song thinned into night, we made our way to the suite at the far end of the hall, a room with 2 lamps on low and flowers arranged to look like a quiet promise. I set my bouquet on the dresser and heard it rustle as it settled. I felt that rustle in my chest. Julian removed his jacket and laid his watch on the table and looked at the wall past me. I told him I had saved something sweet from the dessert tray in case we got hungry, and he said he was fine, and then he said, I am tired, not unkind, not sharp, just flat like a page with no ink. He turned to the smaller bed beneath the window and I chose not to speak because sometimes silence is a shelter, while you gather the words that belong to you. I lay still and listened to the clock again, counting the calm between each tick. The lilies softened in the dark and the room smelled like ceremony and wax and a ghost of smoke. A branch tapped the glass and I remembered a childhood night when the same noise made me think of angels, and I smiled at the memory because peace is often a memory before it becomes a fact. I told myself to rest, that morning would be bright, that he would wake and find the part of himself that had dimmed under the weight of the day. I told myself everything worth keeping requires a patient hand. I closed my eyes and drew breath that felt like the first steps of a prayer. The first night as a wife held its breath like the house was listening to us decide who we were. And I lay very still and told myself that quiet can be the softest version of love. The lilies on the dresser released a slow sweet perfume that folded into the warm wax of the candles and the faint starch of fresh linen. I counted the seconds between the clock taps and tried to stitch them into a blessing. Julian had said I am tired in a voice that did not bruise but did not hold me either, and he turned to the smaller bed beneath the window and settled there with his back to me as if the day had weighed him into a different shape. I watched the thin rectangle of streetlight on the curtains rise and fall with the wind, and I let my mind step back into the safe brightness of the reception where music braided through the trees and my father told a story that made people laugh and swallow tears at the same time. I told myself a long day makes clumsy men, and that kindness is a patient room where the air is allowed to clear. The quiet grew into something with edges. It touched my arms and sat on my chest and asked me questions I did not want to answer. I turned my face into the pillow and breathed until the questions softened. Somewhere down the hall a door hinge sighed. A pipe clicked and settled. The house was old enough to remember everything that had been promised within its walls, and young enough to keep a few new secrets. I do not know when sleep found me. It must have been the kind that schemes the surface and slips away at any sound, because when the noise came it cut straight through me. A soft sound, not the fall of something heavy, not voices carrying careless through a party, but a short stifled breath that reached like a thread and pulled me into sitting. The clock said midnight with its steady hands and the air in the room felt thinner, as if someone had opened a door to a colder place. I looked at the narrow bed. Julian was not there. The sheet was creased in the negative of his shape, but the pillow had no weight on it. I pressed my hand to the mattress I had left and felt the heat of my own fear. If I spoke his name, would I sound like a girl who could not read the room she had entered? If I stayed silent, would I lose the chance to know the truth while it was still warm in the air? I pushed the blanket aside and set my feet on the floor. The tile held a trace of daytime warmth near the rug and turned cool the moment I stepped past the edge. The dress lay across the chair like a folded cloud. I tugged a robe over my shoulders and tied the belt in a loose knot and stood still to see if the sound would return. It did. A breath. A soft laugh hushed in the way of people who no walls can bear witness. A whisper that lifted and fell like a sheet. I eased the door open. The hallway kept a pool of light at one end, and then a lane of darkness broken by soft sconces that painted ovals on the floorboards. The window at the far turn showed a ribbon of moon that had pulled a silver path across the lawn. The smell met me before I took 3 steps. Floral and sharp like a bouquet pressed too close to the skin. Not the clean sweetness of my lilies but something brighter that asked to be noticed. My chest knew the scent before my mind said the name. It was not mine. I moved in the careful way a person does when the night has become a test of courage, and the truth has set out a tripwire across the floor. The wallpaper pattern rose and fell in vines, and the wood under my feet gave a slight complaint at every third board, and I counted by 3s so I would know where to place my weight. As I came closer to the end of the hall, the pool of light widened and the air grew warmer with the heat of 2 bodies inside a room that was supposed to be empty. I could see the door now. It was the door to the room Evelyn had claimed earlier in the day, and then surrendered with a graceful excuse about a headache and a quick trip to town. The detail landed in my mouth like a coin. I remembered her hand resting for a moment on my elbow during the reception while she thanked a server for more coffee, and I remembered her smile, and I told myself not to build a house of suspicion around a single beam. But the sounds were building their own house. A small creak that belonged to a mattress. A breath broken into uneven pieces. A hush that was not absence but urgency. I stopped with my shoulder near the jamb and felt my hands shake from the wrists to the fingers. I did not want to put my ear to the wood. I did not want to hear the thing that would split my life into before and after. For a count of 5 I closed my eyes and asked the night to tell me I had misunderstood. Then I leaned in until the cool paint touched my skin. Her voice reached me first. A low laugh, a whisper that tried to swallow itself. I knew that voice the way you know the shape of your own name. Tasha. It did not matter that she kept the sound small. Familiarity ignores walls. I could hear her breath and the way a word breaks when the mouth is open for something other than speaking. I pressed my palm flat to the door because the floor felt like water. I waited for the second sound with a hope so small it might have been a lie I was telling myself to keep from falling. The second sound came and the hope died. His voice. Julian. I did not need full words. A single syllable can drag a curtain from a scene and leave the stage naked. He spoke her name as if he had been saying it like this for a long time in a place I could not see. A laugh caught in his throat. An exhale shaped like a yes. I thought of the vows that had left his mouth only hours before, and I felt them sliding through my hands like pins from a loosened veil, bright useless pieces falling to the floor where I could not gather them fast enough to sew meaning back into anything. I wanted to knock. I wanted to lift my hand and strike the wood and take back every quiet piece of myself I had offered all day. But the silence that rose in me was not weakness. It was a held line. I stepped back half a pace and waited with my eyes open to the long minute that followed. I looked at the brass of the knob and watched the way the hallway light made a small moon on its surface. I stood in that moon and told myself to keep breathing in and out because breath is the only bridge across a night like this. The sounds inside slowed. A whisper turned into a murmur, and then into the hush of 2 people adjusting the story they would tell if the door ever opened on them. I took another half step back. I stood straight. I did not cry. Tears would have blurred the edges and I wanted the edges to be sharp. A hinge spoke softly. The knob turned. The door opened into the light. Julian came out first. His shirt was buttoned wrong at the middle, and his belt carried a twist that did not belong to a man who had spent the last hour sleeping on a narrow bed. He ran a hand through his hair and looked to the side as if the wall might have a line prepared for him. Then he saw me and for a second everything in his face went still. Guilt makes a kind of frost on a man. It smooths him the way ice smooths a puddle until you see your own shape there and do not recognize it. He opened his mouth and did not find a word. Behind him Tasha stepped into the doorway with her heels in her hand, and her hair fallen from its pins and her dress holding the record of a night spent in the wrong timeline. She did not look at me at first. She looked at the floor as if it could lift and save her. Then she raised her head and there I was and there she was and the years we had known each other stood between us like a choir that had forgotten the hymn. The perfume that had followed me down the hall bloomed around her like a fact. My body wanted to shake the scene and watch it fall apart like a snow globe, so that when the pieces floated back down we would be restored to the hour before the clock spoke midnight. But a woman who has been taught dignity by women who survive long storms does not smash the thing she can end with a sentence and a straight back. I stood there and let their silence say what their mouths could not. Julian cleared his throat and glanced toward the window at the far end of the room, as if the moon might sign a note to release him. Tasha lifted one heel, and then the other, as if putting them on would make her a different person than the one the hallway light had just introduced to me. In that long moment I thought of small things. The exact place the hem of my dress had brushed my ankle earlier while I walked over petals. The way my father had tucked his napkin after the toast as if rituals keep the world upright. The way Evelyn had smoothed a tablecloth and left the party with a headache. The way Julian had said I am tired and turned his back to me. None of those small things could hold the weight of the large thing standing open now, but they all pointed to it the way a set of careful signs points toward a destination while pretending you might choose another road. I did not choose another road. I let the truth stand. I let it take up the whole width of the hall. I did not speak because the first words a woman says at the edge of a shattering can become broken glass she has to carry in her mouth for years. I chose to keep my mouth clear for what would come next. The house seemed to listen. Even the clock held its breath for a beat. Somewhere outside a night bird called and the sound was thin and tender like a thread. I watched Julian drop his eyes. I watched Tasha try to rebuild a version of her face that could meet mine. They were both still and frantic at once. That is what guilt does when it is cornered by the simple presence of the person it has injured. I stepped aside the small distance required to let the hallway know I would not block anyone from walking wherever they were determined to go. It was not surrender. It was a line I drew with my body that said I will not push or plead. I will witness. I will remember. I will choose the next step with a clear head. The lilies from our room sent a last ribbon of scent after me, and underneath it the floral sweetness from Tasha wrapped the scene like a label you cannot peel off no matter how carefully you pick at the corner. I stood with my hands at my sides and my chin level and waited for one of them to attempt a story that could live in daylight. None came. The truth did not need help. It had already spoken in voices I could identify in the blackest dark. I let the night place a period on the sentence and I turned the period into a boundary inside my own chest. I did not shout. I did not ask questions that would take me in circles. I kept the question for later, a question for my own mirror. What kind of woman do you decide to be when the love you named out loud becomes a corridor that leads you to this door? I held that question like a warm stone and I stood where I was and I made a quiet promise to the woman I would have to become by morning. On the hallway carpet I stood as if the floor itself had drawn a boundary around my feet, and I let the quiet do what my voice refused to do. Julian looked past me toward the window as if moonlight could offer an alibi, and Tasha held her shoes like a shield that had already failed. And for a long breath none of us moved. I did not beg for answers. I did not coach them toward a gentler lie. I watched their faces settle into the truth I had heard through wood and air. My name is Aaliyah Brooks, and at that doorway I chose a future without pleading. I said his name once, softly, and the sound of it in that narrow light felt like setting a glass down without letting it shatter. Julian, I said, and the syllables did not tremble. He swallowed and said, it is not what you think, and that thin sentence fell to the floor between us and did not get up. Tasha tried to speak but could only shape my name without sound. And for a moment I saw the girl who braided my hair for choir pictures and saved me a seat at the front pew. And seeing her hurt me more than the perfume cloud still hanging in the air. I told them I heard you, not in anger, but in clarity, and the clarity was a stronger light than the sconce above our heads. Julian reached for a story about helping Tasha find something Evelyn had left, and I held the story in my hand like a small brittle thing, and then I set it down because some objects do not deserve display. I asked him where he had been when I lay in our room counting the space between clock ticks, and he answered with a silence that said more than a speech could. The quiet swelled and pressed against us. Somewhere a night bird called once and then went still as if it too respected a line that had been drawn. Tasha lowered her shoes to the floor as if weight had become a confession, and in the soft thud I heard the end of a friendship. I told them I was leaving the suite now, and in the morning I would speak to family, and after that I would speak to the law. And if they had anything to say worth the air it would cost, they could say it then. Julian took a step as if to reach for my wrist, and I moved my arm behind me and met his eyes with the kind of calm that makes a man remember the boundaries of another person. Do not touch me, I said, and my voice did not raise, and the words stood up straight. He said I am sorry and I believed he regretted being seen more than he regretted the act, and I turned away because I did not need to study that difference any longer. I walked back down the hall with my spine tall and my breath measured. The lilies in the suite had faded a little in the dark, and the room greeted me with its quiet as if it knew there are nights when quiet is the only friend a woman can trust. I packed with steady hands. The zipper ran like a thin river. A sleeve hissed as it slid into the suitcase. I took my bouquet and placed it gently in the trash because sometimes ceremony must be taken out before morning. I stood for a moment and looked at the bed that was mine and the bed that was not, and I told the girl I used to be that she had done nothing wrong except believe, and believing is not a crime even when the verdict comes swift. I slipped on flats, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and opened the door to a corridor that seemed longer now that it was holding a truth. As I moved, the night carried the faint scent of rain on stone. At the stair I saw Mr. Earl, the estate night security, standing near the exit with a clipboard and a thermos, a man built like a reliable door. He nodded the way protectors nod at people who do not need saving. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Could not sleep." "Sometimes the old pipes talk," I said, and he smiled a little. He held the door for me and the air outside was a careful cold. The lawn stretched in silver and the sky wore a thin cloud that looked like breath. I walked across the garden and my dress did not trail this time because I had folded the future into a bag. At the gate Miss Joyce appeared as if the night itself had decided I should not be alone with my leaving. She wore a cardigan and carried a pie tin as if she had just remembered there was something sweet that could still be saved from the day. "Child," she said, and the word was not small, it was shelter. I did not tell her the whole thing. I did not need to. Some women hear a certain quiet in another woman and understand its weight. She placed the cardigan around my shoulders and we stood a moment. She asked, "Do you want me to call your parents?" and I asked her to let them sleep until morning because I wanted my mother to have one last night believing the world was still gentle. She nodded and walked me to the parking area and told me she would be close if I needed anything. When I reached my car, the keys felt heavier than they had in the afternoon, the way keys do when they are about to open a different life. I sat in the driver's seat and breathed until my hands knew they could steer. I did not cry. Not yet. Tears come when a body has room for them, and I was still making that room. I drove to my small apartment on the edge of town, and the road unwound under me like a sentence that had remembered its grammar. In the rear view, the estate lights shrank into a cluster of distant stars. Home smelled like cinnamon from a jar I had left open on the counter, and that ordinary scent felt like a hand on my back. I hung the shawl, set the suitcase down, and stood in the kitchen the way a person stands at the shoreline after a wave proves itself larger than expected. I washed my face. I brushed my hair. I wrote 3 lines in my notebook that had held my small plans for the next month, and those lines were simple. You heard the truth. You walked away. You are still whole. Morning arrived gray and honest. I dressed in navy and placed my ring in a small porcelain dish that had once belonged to my grandmother, and as the ring touched the dish I felt a quiet thud move through me like a gavel. I drove back to the estate because running is not the same as leaving, and I wanted the difference to be clear to everyone including myself. Breakfast sounds rose from the dining room as I stepped through the side door. Cups touched saucers. A chair leg made a polite scrape. People laughed the way people laugh when they believe nothing heavy sits nearby. I stood in the doorway long enough to see who was present. My parents. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks looked rested and soft in the light, and my mother lifted her hand to wave before her face changed when she read the shape of mine. Evelyn was not there. Julian and Tasha were not there. Cousins and elders and neighbors were there, and Pastor Green held a plate with fruit and spoke to 2 women from church about a food drive for the shelter. I cleared my throat and asked if I could have a moment in the living room. My voice was even. A few chairs squeaked. People carried their cups and their concern. When the room had settled, I stood where the morning light gathered on the rug. I said good morning and thanked everyone for honoring us yesterday. I said I will speak carefully because I respect every ear in this room, and then I told them what I had heard and what I had seen. I did not add color. I did not paint the air with words it did not need. I said I heard 2 voices I know better than my own sleep, and I said those names out loud, and the saying of them felt like lifting a stone from my chest and placing it on the table where it belonged. The room went so quiet the house seemed to lean forward. My mother covered her mouth and then lowered her hand as if she were reminding herself to breathe with me and not for me. My father stood a little taller like a man choosing to be steady in front of his child. Someone near the back set a cup down and the porcelain clicked like a small bell. A cousin whispered "Lord help" and then caught herself and folded the words back into her lap. Pastor Green closed his eyes and opened them again with a look that can hold a storm and still ask where the umbrellas are stored. I said I will be filing for divorce on grounds of adultery, and I said it plain because plain words do not crack under pressure. I said I do not want a spectacle. I want clarity. I will take my things and leave this place today. I asked that my side of the family not visit anger upon his side because anger has a way of reproducing itself, and I will not raise its children. I asked for privacy to pack. My mother reached me first and wrapped me in her arms, and all the years of her strength climbed my spine and held my head. My father pressed his hand to my shoulder and said, "We are here." And I nodded because that truth was a raft. Miss Joyce came in then from a side door holding that same pie tin, and when she saw the shape of the room she stopped and placed it on the table like an offering and stood in the doorway with her hands together. I felt the room decide in my favor. It was not a vote spoken out loud. It was a shift in air. A gentle leaning toward the person who had told the truth first. In that lean there was also grief, and I let it move through me without trying to arrange it into something prettier. I told my parents I would go upstairs with 2 aunties and gather my things. Aunt Denise and Aunt Roberta rose. Women with hands that know how to sort a life in 30 minutes. We walked the hallway together. Aunt Denise kept an eye on the corners the way a person does when she knows shock can lower the awareness of a moving body. In the suite the flowers had grown louder somehow, though they were the same flowers in the same vases. I opened the wardrobe and lifted each hanger as if it were a page I needed to turn carefully. Aunt Roberta folded the veil with the reverence of someone handling a flag. Aunt Denise zipped the garment bag and said nothing because the moment did not need advice, it needed witnesses. I placed the items that were mine into cases that were mine, and I left a note on the dresser that held only 2 sentences. "We are finished. The papers will find you." On our way out we met Evelyn in the corridor. She wore a shawl and a look that attempted sorrow but held control beneath it like a fixed spine. She said she was unwell last night and had gone to town. I said nothing to that. I told her I had spoken to the family and would be leaving. She nodded and stepped aside and touched the wall with her fingertips as if the house were listening and might later testify on her behalf. At the top of the stairs Julian appeared. His tie was gone and his shirt was new, but his eyes were old with a night he could not undo. He opened his mouth and I raised my hand with my palm toward him. I said no. Not here and not now. He said my name in a tone that tried for tender and arrived as thin. I said, "Do what you need to do to make the administrative parts easier." Then I walked on. In the foyer a small swirl of whispers formed and then dissolved as if decorum itself had come through and reminded everyone we were still guests under a roof that did not belong to us. Mr. Earl opened the door and the day stepped in with a steady light. He said, "I can walk you to your car if you like," and I said, "Thank you, I will be fine." He did not insist, which is what respect looks like. In the driveway I placed the luggage in the trunk and closed it with a simple click. My parents came out with 1 bag each and my mother asked if I wanted her to ride with me. I said I wanted to drive alone so I could hear my thoughts without company for a stretch. She nodded and placed a hand on my cheek and said, "Come by the house after you rest. We have stew." And the normal word stew steadied me in a way no speech could. I got in the car and I did not look back through the windshield. Some thresholds do not deserve a last glance. I drove with both hands on the wheel, and a mind that watched itself think to make sure the path ahead stayed visible. At a red light I allowed 3 tears to fall. They came without heat. They were not a storm. They were the beginning of a wash. I told myself there would be more. Monday began with a list and a cup of tea and a room that smelled like cinnamon and soap, and I sat at my small kitchen table and wrote the first 3 tasks in a hand that did not shake. Call attorney Lena Patel, secure my accounts, gather evidence. Then I breathed until the breath felt like it was mine again and I dialed the number Ms. Joyce had pressed into my palm the night before. Lena answered on the second ring with the steady tone of a person who spends her days helping women set their feet back on solid ground. I told her my name and the facts without dressing them. She asked 2 or 3 questions to fix the timeline and then said, "We will move with care and with speed. Come by my office at noon and bring whatever you have." I said yes and hung up and walked the apartment, closing every loose loop I could see. I pulled paper statements from a blue folder and opened my laptop to download recent records. I changed passwords and set alerts and deleted my card from a shared flower subscription I had tolerated because it made Julian feel generous. I checked the small safe where I keep my passport and my grandmother ring and a copy of my lease. I placed those in a tote with the file folder. I watered the basil on the window and told the plant it had nothing to worry about. At 10 I called the bank and asked for a fraud and privacy review. The manager said Mr. Darnell can meet you at 3 to set new flags and advisories. I thanked him and wrote 3 in the margin. Then I stood at the sink and watched water run until I remembered that stillness is not the same as peace, and I turned the faucet off and picked up my keys. The drive into town felt like a lesson in attention. The same streets wore a slightly new light. People crossed at the bakery corner with bags that rustled and a bus exhaled and a woman in a yellow coat laughed into her phone, and none of them knew about my night, and I felt a small relief in that because ordinary life is a safety net we forget to see. Lena office was on the second floor over a pharmacy with a bell that chimed a clean single note when I opened the door. The waiting room held 2 plants and a glass jar of mints and a copy of a local paper with a headline about a food drive. The receptionist smiled and took my name, and then Lena was there in a navy dress with sleeves that made her look as practical as she sounded. She shook my hand and led me into a room with a window that faced a maple tree, and she said, "Start where you like." And I did. I told her about the wedding, the promise, the quiet, the hallway, the door, the voices, and the morning speech. I left out the parts that ached in favor of the parts that could be filed and stamped. Lena listened, and her listening felt like an action, not a pause. When I finished, she said, "We will file for divorce on grounds of adultery. I will send a preservation notice to the venue for hallway camera footage and staff logs. We will request copies of the room assignments and the key card records if available. We will also draft a letter instructing opposing parties to preserve phone data and messages." She asked if I had support, and I said my parents and my church and a neighbor who knows when to knock. She nodded as if a team had just taken the field, and then she laid out steps the way a nurse lays out instruments, clean simple items in a row. I initial here and sign this. I read each page and I signed, and then I asked a question that had been sitting in the back row of my mind with its hand half raised. "What about the cost of all this?" Lena smiled a little and said, "We will be careful. We will keep the work efficient. And I have a fund for clients in immediate need that covers some hours so you can begin without fear." I thanked her in a voice that went soft because dignity is strong but relief is still a warm thing when it arrives. She sent me away with a packet and a checklist and the instruction to eat something sturdy and to rest if I could. I went downstairs and walked to a diner where the coffee is loyal and the eggs are always hot. I ate slowly and watched the road and let the clatter of plates remind me that noise can be harmless. At 3 I met Mr. Darnell at the bank and we set new authorizations and alerts, and I added a passcode that only my mother and I know, which is the name of a hymn we both love. He asked if there was any shared debt that required attention, and I told him no. My bakery accounts had been kept separate by choice, and that choice met me now like a friend I had remembered to call. I left with a folder of confirmations and I went to Honey and Thyme because my hands needed to work. Flour does not ask questions. The bell over the bakery door sang and the smell of vanilla and butter rose to meet me. My assistant Camila looked up with eyes that said, "I know something is wrong, but I will wait for you to tell me how to help." I told her the basics and said I might be quieter than usual for a few days, and she nodded and tied her apron tighter as if a knot can be a promise. The rest of the week moved like a careful river. I baked before sunrise and I met with Lena on Wednesday to sign the petition and again on Friday to review the service plan. I drafted a short message to my vendors and regulars announcing a brief soft schedule, and they wrote back with notes that were small and kind. "Love the peach scones. We are with you. Take your time." I took orders for a church luncheon and a retirement party, and I stood at the mixer and listened to it hum. At night I wrote in my notebook. The same notebook that had held wedding tasks now held lines like a scaffolding for my new life. Close out the joint subscription. Check the lease for any clauses I must note. Call Pastor Green about space for a free baking class for girls on Saturdays. On Sunday I sat in the third pew with my parents and the choir sang a song that moves like a river over stones, and I felt the weight in my chest shift. After service the women gathered around me in a circle that did not feel like spectacle. It felt like a ring of soft armor. They told me stories that were not gossip. They were testimonies. One said, "Honey, I left a man in '89 and all I took was my child and my skillet, and I have eaten well ever since." Another said, "The first night alone is a hard night, but the third night you will sleep." Pastor Green prayed over me with a hand that hovered and did not press. Later that afternoon I called Lena and told her I was ready to move as quickly as the court would let us. On Monday morning a courier served Julian through his attorney with the filing and the preservation notice. I did not mark the hour on my calendar. He sent 2 text messages that I did not answer. They were polite and vague and used the word misunderstanding twice. I set my phone face down and sifted powdered sugar like snowfall over a tray of lemon bars, and the sight of the sugar put a small shine on the day. Word traveled the way word does in any town with porches and parking lots. I did not feed it, but I did not try to starve it either. I let the truth do the work. By the second week I felt my hand strong again. I added a breakfast sandwich to the menu and ran a small special for seniors on Tuesdays. The line at the door grew longer than I had planned for, and I hired a part-time student who smiled with her whole face. Woman from the newspaper visited and took a photo of a plate of biscuits and asked me about the name of my shop. I said honey is for sweetness and time is for the time it takes to heal. She scribbled and said that will read well. She did not ask about my marriage and I did not offer it. The article came out the next Friday and business doubled the following week. I took that blessing and put it in a savings account named Future. Some nights I heard that thin laugh from the hallway in a dream. And I sat up and put my hand on the table to feel that it was real and solid. Then I rose and made tea and stood by the window until the dream thinned. One afternoon Ms. Joy stopped by with a bag of peaches and a request that I speak at the community center about starting small businesses. I said yes because saying yes to the future strengthens it. We set a date and I wrote 3 bullet points on a paper napkin that later became a handout. Keep clean books, keep separate accounts, keep your word. By the end of the month Lena called to say we had a preliminary date to meet with the other side for a conference. She prepared me for the room the way a friend might prepare you for a swim in cold water. In and out with purpose. I wore a navy dress and sat with my back straight and my breath slow. Julian arrived with a lawyer and a look that aimed for reasonable. There were no grand speeches. Lena led with facts and timelines and requests. The attorney said they would respond and we adjourned. Outside in the parking lot the air smelled like hot pavement and mowed grass and Lena said go get yourself something sweet and go back to work. That is the best medicine. I laughed because sometimes medicine is exactly a slice of peach pie after a long dry conversation. Rumors about Julian and Tasha reached me in fragments that felt less like news and more like a distant storm. Neighbors whispered that their building manager had asked them to leave after too many late arguments and that Tasha had missed 2 shifts at her job and that Evelyn had been seen at a charity event smiling with every tooth while her eyes looked like someone had put a pane of glass between her and the world. I kept my focus on my counter and my ovens and the faces that came through the door. I practiced a sentence that became a habit. I am focusing on my work and my well-being. Thank you for your concern. My parents came by most evenings with containers I was to keep. My mother stew and my father cornbread. They sat at a corner table and I closed early so we could eat together. We talked about the mundane because the mundane is a raft that can hold the whole family. On a Thursday night after the dinner dishes were rinsed and stacked my father asked me what I wanted from next year aside from the legal closure. I said I wanted to train 2 young bakers and open a small cart for festivals. I wanted to take a short trip to the coast and watch the ocean do its old blue work. I wanted to read 3 books I had put off and learn 1 song on the piano well enough to play it for my mother. He nodded and said write it down. The heart likes to see a plan. I wrote it down that night and folded the paper under a refrigerator magnet shaped like a pear. By the 2nd month I began offering free Saturday morning classes for girls from the neighborhood. The laughter in the kitchen reset something in me that nothing else could touch. The students wore aprons that were too large and pride that fitted them just right. We stirred batter and talked about how recipes are just stories you can eat. By the end of the 3rd month I had paid off 2 small loans and signed a lease on a storage space. Lena called with an update that the court had granted our requests for certain records and that the next phase would be slower but steady. She said I was doing well and that she wished more clients had a job that filled their hands and their hours with something that rises. I thanked her and said, it was not my strength alone, it was older than me. It was my grandmother whispering measure with your eye and taste with your tongue. It was church ladies passing down how to fold air into eggs. It was every woman who had ever rebuilt a life in a kitchen with a window. On a late afternoon the sky went from blue to pewter and a summer storm rolled in and I stood at the doorway watching the first wide drops hit the sidewalk. The scent of rain on hot stone rose and I felt a new kind of quiet settle in my chest, not the quiet of being ignored, not the quiet of the hallway, but the quiet you get when your feet are planted and the house around you holds. I locked up and drove to my parents' house for dinner, and when my mother opened the door she looked at my face and smiled the smile she saves for long journeys completed in everyday clothes. She said sit and eat and tell me one thing you learned today. I said I learned that sugar dusting a warm cake will melt into a gloss if you are patient, and she said patience is what makes everything shine. Later that night I wrote a single line in my notebook, justice moves like bread in the oven. It looks still until it is suddenly ready. I closed the book and slept without a dream. 3 years later the morning light poured across the bakery floor like a blessing that knew my name, and I unlocked the door with a key that fit clean because I had earned every turn of the lock, and I set out the trays and breathed in the warm scent of butter and vanilla. and the soft lemon of fresh mop water, and told myself that peace can smell like work done well before the town is fully awake. Honey and Thyme had grown into 3 locations and a little production kitchen that hummed like a low song, and the newspaper kept a framed photograph of our peach pies on a wall near the city desk, and the radio host liked to drop by for a cinnamon roll before the morning traffic report and ask me one quick question about small business for the listeners who were sitting at stoplights with coffee cups and a hope to begin again. I taught the Saturday class for girls in flour-dusted aprons and kept a scholarship jar next to the register that read lessons for little hands, and the jar filled itself with quiet kindness every week. My parents came by most Thursdays to taste whatever I was testing, and my mother would say too much nutmeg or just enough almond, and my father would say the crust is respectful, which made us laugh because he meant it held together. On a mild evening in September, I attended a food festival on the courthouse lawn and watched neighbors pass from booth to booth with paper boats of hot fish and iced tea in plastic cups that sweated against their palms, and I felt inside my chest a steady river instead of a hole. Daniel Carter had been part of that river for a while by then. We met at a logistics roundtable where he spoke softly about routes and margins, and how a delivery schedule is a promise you make to everyone who depends on you, and he listened to me with a patience that felt like bedside lamps after a long day. Not bright but sufficient and near. He did not ask for my story, and he did not avoid it when I chose to offer parts of it. He was simply present, the way good furniture holds a room without announcing itself. We walked the long path at the park on Sundays after church, and he asked about the recipes my grandmother made without measuring, and I asked about the map of cities he had in his head from years of trucking with his father, and he said the interstate can be a prayer if you let the lines carry you right. He knew how to laugh in a way that did not startle my nerves, and he knew how to leave silence in a conversation, so that the next sentence could find its best shape. There was no fireworks in my body. There was a lamp lit in a known room. One late afternoon we sat on my apartment balcony with tea and a bowl of cherries, and he read a page from a book he liked, and I watched a neighbor water a tomato vine that had climbed past the first rail, and when he set the book down he said, "I do not want to fix you. I want to walk beside you," and I said, "I do not need to be saved," and he said, "I know," and the evening held. The day Julian returned began like any other, with a pre-dawn drive to the kitchen to check on a batch of dough that had to rise at the exact right pace. And it was only after lunch, when the light was blunt and honest across the counter, that I looked up and saw him in the doorway of the shop holding nothing in his hands, as if emptiness were a form of politeness. He had the look of a man who had not slept well in months, and the edge of his jacket was shiny where frequent wear rubs the fabric thin, and his eyes were a color I did not remember, not because they had changed but because what I once used to see had. He asked for 5 minutes and used my name with the care of a person approaching a farm gate whose hinges could be old or new. I set the dish towel down and told Camila to finish the tray, and moved to a small table near the window. He sat. His hands lay flat like he knew better than to reach. The street outside remained calm. A stroller wheel clicked over a seam in the sidewalk. A bus sighed at the stop. He said he had followed the articles and the awards, and he was glad for me, and he used the word proud as if it were a coin he was unsure would be accepted. He said he had been wrong and foolish and confused then, and that he was different now, and that he wondered whether we could talk about what had happened with gentleness. I watched his mouth make those shapes, and I listened the way you listen to a weather report for a city you will not visit. I did not feel my pulse race, and I did not feel my throat close, and I was grateful for the proof that healing had been working while I was not looking. I told him we had nothing to rebuild, and that I did not hold a ledger in my chest for him any longer. I said, "I wish you well, because wishing you ill would rent space inside me, and I have tenants already who pay in peace." He nodded and looked toward the case of pies and did not stand up right away, and then he said he had not married and he had not stayed with Tasha, and that life had twisted and he was sorry for the harm he had caused. I said, "I heard you and thank you for saying it, and that is all," and he pressed his lips together the way men do when a courtroom decision is final, and then he stood and touched the brim of nothing like a gesture from a different century and walked out into the sun. It was not triumph. It was not revenge. It was the smooth close of a door that had warped and now hung true. When the bell stopped ringing, Daniel stepped in from the sidewalk with a bag of sandwich wraps for the staff and placed it on the counter and looked at my face and simply opened his arms, and I stepped into them and put my forehead to his shoulder, and we stood in the quiet hum of a bakery that had chosen me as much as I had chosen it. That evening I drove to my parents' house with a small peach cobbler, and we ate on the porch where the air smelled like cut grass, and someone nearby was learning the trumpet and hitting enough right notes to be forgiven for the rest. My mother asked me how the day had been, and I told her like a sentence that closes with a period, not an exclamation. She smiled and said good, and my father poured tea and asked if Daniel had called, and I said yes and that he would come by on Saturday to help fix a loose hinge on the pantry door because he liked to fix things that did not shout about being broken. We talked about the church rummage sale and about Miss Joyce, who was organizing volunteers with the authority of a general and the tenderness of a nurse. Before I left, my mother pressed a small envelope in my hand with a verse printed on a card and said, "Put this where you can see it when the morning is heavy." At home I taped it inside a cabinet, and when I reached in for a jar of sugar the next day I saw it and felt the lift of something steady. As for Tasha, I learned in pieces what had become of her. A cousin mentioned that Tasha had moved to a different city and that she had tried to start a small venture which did not find footing, and that she had been seen at a service one Sunday sitting in the back alone for the first half and then leaving quietly before the benediction. And I felt the particular ache that comes when a good friend and a terrible moment occupy the same memory, and you cannot keep one without the other. I did not reach out. Not from anger and not from pride. I let the story end where it had ended, for my safety and for the peace I had built. Sometimes justice is not loud. It is the silence where chaos once sent its invitations. I kept living. The bakery trained 2 young assistants for my Saturday class, and they moved like quick birds through the kitchen and learned to read the dough by scent and by sight. The scholarship jar became a formal fund after a regular customer quietly wrote a generous check and asked me to keep her name out of it, and we added a second night class for women learning to restart careers after a hard season, and the room filled with laughter that shook flour from sleeves. Daniel and I drove to the coast for 2 days when the holiday rush had passed, and we walked a cold beach with our shoes in our hands, and we let the Atlantic write its white lines, and we did not try to talk over the sea. He told me about the first time he drove through the night with his father, and how the lights of towns looked like spilled salt, and I told him about the first cake I baked alone and how I cried when it fell, and how my grandmother made me cut it into layers and frost it into something beautiful, and then feed it to people so I would learn that a fall is not an ending. On the balcony that night I took his hand and he took mine, and we sat in a quiet that asked for nothing. A week later a letter came addressed in a careful hand I did not recognize, and inside was a short note from Evelyn with the kind of polite regret that sits like lace atop stone. She wrote that she hoped I was well, and that she wished the wedding had been different, and that she held no ill will. I laid the card on the table and looked at it the same way I look at a window I do not plan to open, and then I placed it in a box with other papers and did not let it shape the day. Healing prefers the work of present tense. The court process concluded more slowly than my heart would have chosen, but it concluded all the same, and when the final decree arrived Lena called and said, "You are clear and free," and I thanked her for the kind of labor that lets a woman sleep, and I baked her a caramel cake and delivered it still warm, because some victories should be eaten while the sugar still shines. On a soft evening in late spring we gathered in the community center for the first cohort celebration for women who had completed the night classes, and families filled the folding chairs and children clapped before anyone LSE did. I spoke for 5 minutes about the way truth can cut, and also clean a wound, and about the value of steady work and steady bread, and I looked into faces that carried storms, and I recognized the light that follows. After the applause my mother hugged me and said, "Your voice found its room," and I held her and thought about the hallways my voice had traveled. When I write this now I sit on my balcony at a small table with a cup of tea and a line of sun walking across the railing, and Daniel reading beside me, and the city doing its ordinary evening business under our feet. Peace does not sound like fireworks. It sounds like a page turning and a kettle clicking off, and the known creak in the cabinet door, and the breath of someone you trust settling next to yours. If your life has recently split along a line you did not draw, then let me tell you this as a sister and as a witness. The truth will stand even if it sways at first. The betrayer will pay a price even if you do not see the receipt. You can rise even if rising at the beginning looks like standing in place and counting your breaths. Choose your dignity. Keep your accounts clean. Keep one friend who answers late calls. Keep one practice that returns you to yourself when the world has taken a handful of your hours. Let silence be part of your power. And when a gentler love arrives, do not call it small, because it does not shout. Gentle love holds. Gentle love returns. Gentle love builds. If this story touched a place you thought had gone numb, tell me where you are listening from and what you have learned about strength that stays.